The winter wind tore across northern France like a relentless whip, whipping shredded banners and tattered uniforms into the snow. The remains of Saint-Lô were a landscape of devastation. Buildings burned to skeletal frames, trenches filled with icy water, and the stench of smoke, death, and unwashed bodies saturating the air. Among the chaos, a small group of American soldiers huddled behind a ruined freight depot, trying to remain unseen. Private Darius Cole leaned against a collapsed wall, fighting back the pain that radiated from a deep shrapnel wound in his left thigh. His uniform was torn and crusted with dried blood. His hands, raw from weeks of gripping the rifle he'd been forced to abandon, trembled with cold. For 3 days, he had been alone after a German ambush shattered his unit. His comrades either lay dead in the snow, had vanished into the forest, or had surrendered. Darius had chosen neither, crawling through the snow, hoping for the impossible, to survive without being captured. Yet here he was, shivering in exhaustion and terror, realizing that fate had other plans. From the forest, the thrum of engine tracks reached his ears, a convoy of military trucks. Darius's heart sank. Not German, he reminded himself. Not the enemy. But as the trucks grew closer, his stomach knotted. There was no way to know who they would be. The idea of white American soldiers discovering him filled him with dread. In his mind, capture by his own country's men would be no mercy. Segregation, punishment, humiliation, the unspoken horrors for black soldiers who fell behind the front. A truck screeched to a halt, splashing mud over the ruins. 2 MPs leapt down, rifles in hand, and barked orders. "Move it! Hands up! On the ground!" Darius obeyed immediately, dropping to the frozen dirt. The butt of a rifle slammed into his back, sending shockwaves up his spine. He closed his eyes and braced himself for the blows he had been warned were inevitable. "You're lucky we're not killing stragglers today," one of the MPs sneered. His voice was sharp, edged with contempt. "You, boy, move." Darius obeyed, each step dragging his aching leg through snow and debris. Behind him, the forest swallowed the last of his freedom. In the back of the truck, he was packed between German prisoners. They were younger than he was, pale, eyes wide, trembling with fear. They were offered blankets and water, which they gratefully accepted. Darius received nothing. The truck jolted, shaking the bound men violently. He pressed his face into the rough wooden side, murmuring to himself, "It hurts when I sit down." His voice was nearly lost in the rumble of the engine, but it carried the truth. His body ached not only from shrapnel, but from the weeks of crawling over frozen rocks, the bruises from rough handling, and the constant cold gnawing at his limbs. Hours passed. Each jolt of the truck was a fresh reminder of his helplessness. Darius tried to focus on the snow-blurred landscape rushing past, but his mind wandered back to his unit. He remembered Sergeant Howard Banks, yelling orders during the ambush, then screaming as he was cut down. He remembered Private Leon Morris, a boy barely 19, covering the rear and giving his life to allow others to escape. They were gone, and Darius had survived not through heroism, but by collapsing into unconsciousness just as the enemy closed in. The truck eventually slowed, stopping before a high ridge where searchlights cut through the night. Darius was shoved from the back, feet sinking into icy mud. Around him, the other prisoners were guided toward a wooden gate topped with barbed wire. At first glance, the camp seemed orderly, almost like an American military installation. But he knew better. The Germans were treated with minimal cruelty, but he had no illusions about what awaited him. "Strip," a guard barked, and Darius complied. His hands shook as he removed his jacket, boots, and gear. The cold bit at his exposed skin. He was examined, marked, and issued a plain gray prisoner uniform. No blanket, no comfort. He was given a cot covered in rough straw. The wind seeped through the cracks of the hut, and the chill penetrated to his bones. Sleep did not come. Every shadow, every creak of timber, felt like the approach of a threat. Darius thought of his family in Georgia, his younger brother Samuel, and the letters they had written, always urging him to stay alive, to survive, to return home. But how could he survive here, in the hands of those he had been trained to trust? 3 days later, the camp received a new group of arrivals. Black soldiers like him, all wounded, all disoriented, all wary. They huddled together in the dim light, sharing whispered stories of ambushes, desertion, and betrayal. One man, Isaiah Turner, sat beside Darius, murmuring, "I thought I'd die before I was treated like this, by my own." Darius nodded silently. It was a truth none of them could deny. Survival was a luxury, dignity, a memory. They had been trained to believe that surrender to the enemy was shameful. But here, their own soldiers treated them as if surrendering, even to death, was inevitable. On the 4th night, a Red Cross nurse arrived, Claire Dubois, a young Frenchwoman with piercing eyes that seemed to see past uniforms, ranks, and color. She approached Darius cautiously, kneeling beside him. "You must be starving," she said, her voice soft. "You're wound. It will not heal this way." Darius recoiled. "Why help me? I'm not German." She smiled faintly. "Because you are a human being. And sometimes that is enough." She treated his shrapnel wound carefully, cleaning it, wrapping it in fresh bandages, and whispering instructions in French. Darius, exhausted and skeptical, followed her instructions. Hesitant, not fully trusting, but compelled by the kindness she showed. For the first time since his capture, he felt the stirrings of hope, not for escape, not for comfort, but for acknowledgement of his humanity. But hope, he knew, was dangerous in a place like this. The morning sun rose pale and gray over Camp Fleury's, a place that looked orderly from afar but revealed its cruelty up close. Rows of barracks stood like grim sentinels behind barbed wire, their windows darkened and frosted, the air heavy with the smell of smoke, mud, and unwashed bodies. Snow still clung stubbornly to the ground, melting slowly under the weak light, mixing with the camp's grime to form slippery, treacherous paths. Private Darius Cole shuffled into the courtyard, escorted by 2 guards who muttered insults under their breath. The Germans were already moving with practiced efficiency, taken to warm tents for processing, while Darius was shoved toward a small wooden hut at the edge of the camp. The hut's door creaked loudly as it opened, revealing Lieutenant Raymond Sloan, a thin, pale man whose sharp eyes were colder than the February frost. His uniform was neat, his boots polished, and every gesture calculated. "Name?" Sloan asked, flipping through a worn notebook. "Private Darius Cole, 92nd Infantry," Darius said, his voice hoarse. Sloan paused, one thin eyebrow arching. "A colored unit?" Darius nodded. Sloan's lips twisted into a faint sneer. "Then you should have stayed with them. We're sorting spies, deserters, men who are inconvenient. Until we're sure of your usefulness, you stay here." The hut smelled of mildew and burned straw. Darius sank onto the rough bench that served as a cot. The splinters bit into his back, and every movement sent sharp pain through his injured leg. Outside, the sounds of the camp carried through the thin walls. Boots crunching in snow, German soldiers singing quietly to keep themselves sane, guards yelling, and somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of tanks preparing to roll out. 3 days passed in a haze of cold, hunger, and uncertainty. The Germans received blankets, food, and even letters that had been held in transit. Darius received scraps, harsh words, and scorn. Every small kindness that arrived from the Red Cross or from camp personnel had to be earned through whispered negotiations, the quiet persuasion of a sympathetic eye, or sheer luck. It was on the third night that Darius first heard a knock on the door. He tensed, ready for a guard or another punishment. Instead, the door opened to reveal Claire Dubois, the French nurse. She held a small bag of supplies, bandages, ointment, and a small tin of preserved food. "Mon Dieu," she muttered as she examined his wound. "They have not treated you at all?" Darius shook his head. Claire's eyes narrowed. "I will not allow this," she said. She stepped outside and confronted the guards. Their leader, a sergeant with a thick face and thicker hands, laughed. "She is wasting her time," he said. "He is just another boy. He will live or die depending on the camp's mood." Claire returned, defiant. She cleaned the wound, wrapped it with fresh bandages, and whispered instructions in broken English. "Keep it clean. Move carefully. Eat what you can." Darius obeyed, though every motion reminded him of his captivity. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the guards were distracted or absent, he found himself speaking softly to her. "Why help me?" he asked one night, voice barely above a whisper. "Because," she said, meeting his gaze with steady eyes, "you are still human, and sometimes that is enough." Her words lingered, a fragile flame in the freezing darkness of the camp. For the first time, Darius felt seen, not as an inconvenience or an outsider, but as a person, albeit one trapped in a cruel system that refused to recognize him. Days turned into weeks. Darius observed the camp closely. Guards patrolled, indifferent to the suffering of black soldiers, yet meticulous about enforcing rules for German prisoners. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore. Every action, every insult, every deprivation confirmed what he had feared. In his own army, his color made him expendable. Among the few sympathetic figures was Corporal Henry Becker, a young white radio operator captured in a neighboring ambush. Becker had been shot in the shoulder and thrown into the same processing area as the Germans. Though initially wary, he began to notice the disparity in treatment. One evening, as Darius labored to clean the camp's latrines while Becker tended the infirmary, he muttered, "I don't understand. Why him, but not you?" Darius shrugged. "It's nothing new. I learned long ago that being black in uniform doesn't make you safe. Sometimes it makes you a target." Becker stared at him, conflicted. For the first time, the young soldier saw what he had been blind to. The war wasn't just against the Axis. It was also against those who were considered lesser by their own people. The camp's daily routine was grueling. Black POWs were assigned menial labor, often in freezing conditions under constant supervision. German prisoners received basic comforts, warm meals, blankets, and medical attention. It was a moral inversion that Darius could not reconcile. Yet, amid the harshness, there were moments of humanity. Claire returned whenever she could, slipping past the guards with a careful nod to treat wounds and offer small comforts. A few prisoners, German or American, shared rations or whispered words of encouragement. It was enough to keep Darius alive, physically and mentally. On the 21st day, he received a surprise. A letter slipped under the door, carefully folded, written in familiar handwriting. His heart raced as he unfolded it. "Darius, I heard about Fleury's. Hold on. We will not forget you. Keep your head up. Elijah Green, 92nd Infantry." Tears filled his eyes. The outside world still remembered him, still considered him one of theirs. Yet within the camp he was invisible, a shadow among shadows, valued only insofar as he could be exploited. That night, As he lay on the rough straw, Darius whispered again, "It hurts when I sit down." But this time, the pain wasn't just physical. It was moral, political, and deeply personal. He had survived the enemy only to be betrayed by his own countrymen, by the very army he had sworn to serve. Snow had melted into a gray, slippery sludge when Darius Cole woke to the shrill whistle of the morning roll call. The camp's routine had become a grim rhythm. Wake, march, labor, eat, sleep, repeat. Yet the monotony was a fragile mask over the deeper torment that gnawed at him each day. The cold was relentless, the food inadequate, and the whispers of despair hung in every corner of the barracks. That morning, a new arrival was brought to the camp. A young black soldier, barely 20, trembling and bloodied. He was shoved into the hut where Darius and a handful of others slept. The boy's name was Calvin Rivers, and he had been captured after his unit was ambushed near Cannes. His uniform was shredded, his hands raw from chains, and his eyes wide with fear. Darius watched silently as Calvin collapsed onto the straw cot. "You'll be fine," Darius whispered. Though the words felt hollow even to him, Calvin shook his head. They hate us. They'll kill me." Darius pressed a hand to the boy's shoulder. "No, they won't. Not yet. Survive. That's all you need to do right now." The hours passed with Darius observing the subtle differences in treatment throughout the camp. German POWs were led to warm huts, their injuries treated with antiseptics and careful attention. Black POWs were left in freezing tents, expected to clean, labor, and endure the harshest conditions. The disparity was brutal. Each day chipped away at Darius's resolve, making survival a mental as well as physical challenge. By the end of the week, the tension had reached a boiling point. Darius noticed the whispers spreading among the black prisoners, a mix of despair, anger, and quiet determination. Isaiah Turner had begun organizing small acts of defiance, refusing menial labor when guards weren't watching, sharing extra rations, and supporting the newly arrived Calvin. During a particularly frigid morning, a guard barked orders for a work detail. Darius and Isaiah were instructed to clear debris near the perimeter fence, their hands numb, their bodies aching. Calvin lagged behind, struggling with the weight of his fatigue. "You can't keep up," Isaiah muttered under his breath. I'll try," Calvin gasped, but his face betrayed the panic rising within him. As they worked, Darius's thoughts drifted to home, Detroit, to his family, to the segregated hospitals where he had served as a nurse before the war. There, he had been trained to save lives, yet treated as inferior. Here, captured by his own countrymen, he suffered neglect and humiliation. It was a cruel inversion of morality that seemed impossible to reconcile. Then, as the sun reached its apex, something unexpected happened. A convoy of American Red Cross trucks arrived, escorted by U.S. Army officers. They carried medical supplies, blankets, and food. The camp commander, a grizzled veteran named Major Leonard Harwood, was approached by a female officer, Captain Eleanor Voss, whose calm authority and professional demeanor immediately drew attention. Captain Voss walked among the prisoners, inspecting conditions, asking questions, and making notes. When she reached Darius, her eyes softened. "You're wounded," she said quietly, examining the shrapnel scar along his thigh. "How long has this been like this?" "Since the ambush," Darius muttered, shrinking from her gaze. "Weeks," Captain Voss frowned. "That's unacceptable. You'll be moved to the infirmary immediately." For the first time in weeks, Darius felt a flicker of hope. The infirmary was warm, stocked with proper supplies, and staffed by women who treated him with a professionalism he hadn't experienced since leaving Detroit. He was assigned to a cot with clean sheets, given a pillow and fed a hot meal. The warmth and food revived him physically, but mentally he remained cautious. Trust had become a dangerous luxury. In the infirmary, Darius met Nurse Margaret Latham, an African-American woman in her early 30s who had been working tirelessly to care for all prisoners. Unlike many staff, she refused to discriminate based on race or nationality. She treated Darius's wounds meticulously, cleaning and rebandaging the shrapnel injury, instructing him on exercises to prevent atrophy. "You're lucky," she whispered one evening as she handed him a tray of food. "Most don't get this kind of care. Not here, not anywhere. Remember it." Darius nodded, silently absorbing the stark contrast. As a soldier, he had faced neglect and bias. As a prisoner, he was suddenly the recipient of professional attention and human dignity. The incongruity gnawed at him, forcing him to question everything he had been taught about loyalty, service, and morality. Yet the camp still held its horrors. The Black POWs continued to face harassment from guards, unfair punishments, and discrimination in labor assignments. Rumors of executions for German deserters circulated, striking terror into Calvin and others. The psychological strain was relentless, and Darius struggled to maintain his composure. One evening, as he rested after a long day of labor, Darius was approached by Corporal Henry Becker, the white radio operator. Becker handed him a small bundle of papers. "Thought you might want these," Becker said quietly. "Some Germans who've been here longer, they've been writing things down. Notes on treatment, conditions, policies. You might find it useful." Darius's hands shook as he opened the bundle. The papers contained meticulous documentation, disparities in treatment, eyewitness accounts, and even statements from guards noting the differences between German and black prisoners. A plan began to form in Darius's mind, a dangerous, audacious plan that could expose the hypocrisy and injustice of the system. If documented correctly, the evidence could reveal the truth, that his captors, when willing, could treat prisoners with dignity and humanity, yet his own country continued to discriminate against black soldiers. The first seeds of rebellion, not of violence but of truth, were planted. Darius began to record everything in secret, copying statements, noting every act of kindness or cruelty, and keeping careful logs of food rations, medical treatment, and living conditions. Calvin Rivers, Isaiah Turner, and a few trusted fellow prisoners assisted discreetly. At night, by candlelight and whispered conversation, they pieced together a growing dossier, proof that could challenge propaganda, prejudice, and the moral blindness of the military hierarchy. Each entry was a reminder. Survival was not enough. Truth and dignity had to survive too. By the end of the chapter, Darius lay awake on his cot, staring at the ceiling. His body still ached. His legs still burned when he shifted. Yet a small spark of determination burned brighter than any fear. "They can try to break me," he whispered to himself, "but they cannot take the truth, and when they see it, maybe they'll have no choice but to change." The days at Camp Fleury's had a rhythm both cruel and predictable. Dawn brought the shrill whistle. Hours were spent in backbreaking labor, fetching water, clearing debris, or tending to the meager garden plots designated for prisoner work. By nightfall, bodies ached, minds throbbed, and spirits teetered on the edge of despair. Yet amidst this, Darius Cole found a dangerous kind of hope, the hope that truth could be preserved, even under the gaze of those who wished it suppressed. He had carefully hidden his growing collection of evidence beneath the floorboards of his cot. Scraps of paper, testimonies from fellow prisoners, Red Cross reports, and copies of camp orders. Each piece was a fragment of a larger story, one that could expose the cruel irony of his situation, that as a black American soldier, he was treated worse at home and in the army than as a captive in enemy hands. It began with Isaiah Turner, who had developed a cautious optimism since Darius's arrival. Isaiah had a sharp mind and a voice that commanded quiet attention. One evening, he approached Darius with a low whisper. "We can't let this stay hidden," Isaiah said. "We've seen the patterns, the lies, the hypocrisy. We can record it, not just for ourselves, but for anyone who will listen after this ends." Darius nodded, his hands still trembling from the day's labor. "But if we're caught," Isaiah's expression hardened, "then we die. But at least we die knowing we tried. Survival without truth is meaningless." The plan was audacious. Using fragments of paper, whispered conversations, and the occasional sympathetic officer, they began documenting everything in meticulous detail. Food rations, medical care, interactions with guards, and instances of kindness or cruelty. Each night, the prisoners huddled together, copying notes by candlelight, discussing strategies for secrecy, and assigning tasks. Calvin Rivers, though younger and less experienced, proved invaluable in smuggling small scraps of paper between the barracks without detection. Meanwhile, Captain Eleanor Voss continued her inspections, noting the disparities in treatment but unaware of the secret documentation. She treated Darius with a professionalism and fairness that seemed almost surreal in a camp otherwise ruled by neglect and prejudice. Each visit was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered a glimpse of humanity. On the other, it heightened Darius's awareness of just how precarious their situation truly was. One evening, as the prisoners huddled around the meager warmth of a small brazier, Darius spoke in low tones. "We have to make sure this is more than just stories," he said. "We need proof, something undeniable. If we survive, this can't be ignored." Isaiah nodded. "We'll need cooperation from someone in authority. A witness, someone who can back us if we're discovered." Calvin's eyes widened. "And if they catch us, they'll try to silence us," Darius interrupted firmly. "Which is why we have to be meticulous, invisible, precise." The plan was risky, but the prisoners were fueled by a growing sense of moral purpose. They were no longer merely trying to survive. They were fighting for dignity, for truth, for the possibility that their experiences could force the world to confront its contradictions. Tension escalated the following week when a senior officer, Major Leonard Harwood, ordered a surprise inspection. Guards entered the barracks, shining lanterns into every corner, shouting, and shaking prisoners awake. Darius froze, heart pounding, as Calvin clutched a small bundle of notes hidden under his coat. Every nerve in his body screamed for stillness. Major Harwood's eyes scanned the room, stopping on Darius. "Your wounds are healing?" he asked curtly, not unkindly, though the suspicion in his tone was clear. "Yes, sir," Darius replied, voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Harwood moved on, leaving only a lingering sense of danger. The prisoners exhaled quietly, grateful that their hidden documents had gone unnoticed. It was a stark reminder of the razor-thin line between exposure and survival. As winter deepened into early spring, Darius noticed subtle changes in the camp. Guards who had been indifferent or cruel began to show signs of fatigue, and some displayed small gestures of humanity. A shared blanket, a quiet word of warning, a glance that acknowledged the prisoner's suffering. It was not widespread, and it did not erase the injustices, but it hinted at cracks in the rigid facade of authority. This observation became part of their documentation. Darius recorded not only the overt mistreatment but also these unexpected acts of compassion. Each entry added nuance, strengthening the moral argument that dignity could exist even in the heart of oppression, but only if someone chose to uphold it. One afternoon, Darius was called to assist in the infirmary under the supervision of Nurse Margaret Latham. He treated minor wounds, cleaned bandages, and recorded treatment schedules. Margaret, perceptive and intelligent, noticed the careful notes he kept. "You're meticulous," she said quietly. "Do you intend to do something with all this?" Darius hesitated, then nodded. "If we survive, it could change things. Not just here. For everyone like us. For everyone denied dignity." Margaret's eyes softened. "Then you must be careful. Lives depend on your discretion." The moral stakes rose further when a rumor spread through the camp. An inspection team from Geneva had been alerted to investigate prisoner treatment. Darius knew that their secret documentation could suddenly become a matter of life and death. They were faced with a dilemma. Reveal the truth now, risking exposure and punishment, or continue gathering evidence to ensure the integrity of their testimony. The prisoners chose the latter, doubling down on their secrecy, refining their methods, and carefully selecting witnesses who could corroborate their findings. Isaiah and Calvin became experts at stealth, passing notes, recording conversations, and storing evidence in ways that even thorough searches could not detect. By the end of the chapter, Darius sat alone in the infirmary, staring at the growing pile of meticulously organized papers. Each sheet represented courage, vigilance, and the will to expose hypocrisy. "It hurts when I sit down," he whispered again, not because of the physical pain alone, but because the weight of responsibility pressed on him. Yet within that pain was purpose, a quiet, unyielding determination that truth, if preserved, could survive even the most brutal circumstances. And in that moment, Darius understood. Survival was no longer enough. To bear witness, to hold fast to truth, to demand justice in the shadow of cruelty, that was the real fight. Spring had barely settled over Camp Fleury's, but the world within its barbed wire walls was shifting. The snow had melted entirely, leaving slick mud that stuck to boots and made marching an even harsher ordeal. Darius Cole had spent weeks refining his hidden collection of notes, testimonies, and observations, each page a testament to the contradictions and hypocrisies of both captors and captives. The camp itself seemed unaware of the quiet storm brewing among the Black POWs. Guards continued their rounds, issuing orders, punishing minor infractions, and enforcing segregation with rigid discipline. Yet amidst the monotony, subtle cracks were forming. Some guards, exhausted and disillusioned, began offering small, discreet acts of kindness. A warmer blanket, a few extra rations, or even whispered advice about avoiding dangerous labor assignments. Darius recorded every one of these moments, noting not only the cruelty but the humanity that occasionally shone through. Each entry strengthened his understanding of the paradox at the heart of the camp. Dignity was possible, even in captivity, but only if one dared to uphold it. One morning, a convoy of high-ranking officers arrived unexpectedly. Rumors swirled among the prisoners that the camp would undergo an inspection. Anxiety rippled through the barracks. Darius knew this was both a risk and an opportunity. He gathered Isaiah Turner and Calvin Rivers in the dim light of their barracks. "The inspection team gives us a chance," Darius said, voice low but urgent. "If we can record their observations, we can prove that humane treatment is possible. But it's only meaningful if we do it now, before anyone tries to suppress it." Isaiah frowned. "And if we're caught? Then we face the consequences," Darius replied. "But the truth must survive. Lives have depended on discretion this long. It can't fail now." Calvin nodded hesitantly. I'm ready." Together they devised a system. Small scraps of paper were passed during chores. Notes were hidden in hollowed-out logs, and whispered testimonies were memorized and later transcribed by candlelight. The risk was immense. Discovery meant punishment or worse, yet every person involved felt the gravity of their responsibility. During the inspection, Darius was assigned to assist Nurse Margaret Latham. She had noticed the careful attention he paid to records and quietly offered her support, allowing him access to supplies and medical logs that could bolster their evidence. "You're doing more than surviving," she whispered. "You're recording a revolution in microcosm. But be careful. One slip, and everything is gone." Darius nodded, understanding that Margaret's cautious encouragement was both a shield and a responsibility. He began compiling cross-reference logs: rations versus assigned labor, medical treatment versus severity of injury, guard behavior documented alongside prisoner reactions. Every detail added to the growing body of evidence that would challenge propaganda and prejudice alike. Meanwhile, a surprising ally emerged in the form of Sergeant Klaus Reinhardt, a German guard with a strong sense of personal honor. Though officially an enforcer of the camp's rules, he quietly provided information about administrative orders and camp policies, never questioning Darius directly but offering subtle clues that helped the documentation remain accurate and credible. Not all prisoners were convinced that this effort was worth the risk. Fear and despair ran deep. Calvin Rivers, still young and traumatized by capture, occasionally questioned the wisdom of their secrecy. "What if they find it? We could be executed," he whispered one night, huddled in the corner of the barracks. Isaiah turned sharply, voice low but firm. "Do you want to survive only to return home and have no proof of what we endured? This is bigger than fear. It's our legacy. Our truth." Darius watched quietly, weighing each word. Fear was natural. It kept them alive. But courage, he realized, was essential if they hoped to challenge the hypocrisy that surrounded them. The turning point came when Major Leonard Harwood summoned Darius for an unexpected task: assisting with a newly arrived group of prisoners, including Americans who had been wounded in combat. Among them was Lieutenant Rebecca Lang, a young black officer whose unit had been captured after a failed assault in Normandy. Her presence was both shocking and galvanizing. She represented a rare intersection of race and rank in the Army, and she immediately understood the disparities at Camp Fleury's. Rebecca became an invaluable asset. She corroborated Darius's observations, helped organize the hidden documentation, and offered strategic guidance on how to protect their evidence from prying eyes. With her, the prisoners' project gained clarity and structure. By the end of the week, the prisoners had compiled hundreds of pages of detailed records. They had photographic evidence smuggled from sympathetic officers, testimonies of guards and medical staff, and meticulously recorded observations of camp conditions. Darius called a secret meeting with Isaiah, Calvin, and Rebecca. "We have the truth," he said, holding a bundle of papers. "We can't just sit on it anymore. When the war ends, or when we find a chance, we will make sure it's seen. The world needs to know that dignity can be upheld, even in the worst conditions, and that our own people often fail us at home." The plan was audacious. They would survive the final months of captivity while secretly preparing a dossier that could expose hypocrisy, demand reform, and honor the resilience of every prisoner who had suffered. As the days turned into weeks, small victories began to appear. Guards who had been indifferent occasionally intervened to prevent punishments. Minor infractions among prisoners were overlooked when discretion demanded it. Even Major Harwood, stern and intimidating, seemed to respect the efforts of Darius and his team, though he remained unaware of the full scope of their work. For Darius, these moments of recognition were bittersweet. They offered a glimpse of humanity, yet highlighted the deep injustice that had made such efforts necessary. The physical pain from his wounds, the psychological scars of captivity, and the moral contradictions of the camp weighed heavily on him. And still, he whispered the words that had become a refrain. "It hurts when I sit down." But now the pain was layered, not only physical but moral, ethical, and spiritual. Yet with every word, every note, every secret testimony, Darius and his allies were building something stronger than despair. They were building the foundation for a revolution of truth. By the summer of 1945, the distant roar of artillery had faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. Rumors swept through Camp Fleury's. Germany had surrendered, the Pacific Theater was nearing its conclusion, and the world outside the barbed wire fences was beginning to shift. Darius Cole felt a strange dissonance. The war was ending, yet within the camp, life remained a delicate balance of fear, discipline, and fragile hope. His body had healed remarkably under the care of Nurse Margaret Latham and Captain Eleanor Voss, but the emotional scars lingered. Every movement of the guards, every glance from Major Leonard Harwood, reminded him that the truth he had worked so hard to document could vanish in an instant. The surrender of Japan brought an unexpected chance. Allied administrators were dispatched to review prisoner conditions, oversee repatriation, and ensure compliance with international law. Darius convened a secret meeting with Isaiah Turner, Calvin Rivers, and Lieutenant Rebecca Lang. "This is it," Darius whispered. "The war is ending. The world will be watching. Our work can no longer remain hidden. But we must be cautious. Every step counts." Isaiah nodded. "We've risked everything this long. We can't let it slip now." Calvin shifted nervously. "And the guards? What if they find out?" Rebecca's voice was firm. "Some will support us. Others will ignore it. But if we act carefully, our documentation is bulletproof. Hundreds of pages, photographs, testimonies. It's undeniable. The world will see." Over the next 2 weeks, Darius and his team worked tirelessly. They organized their notes into a comprehensive dossier, detailing differential treatment of black versus white prisoners, the acts of kindness and professionalism exhibited by American officers and medical staff, discrepancies between propaganda and reality, including statements from German POWs and sympathetic guards, photographic evidence of barracks, infirmaries, meals, and work assignments. Every piece was meticulously cross-referenced, carefully coded, and hidden in secret compartments beneath cots, in hollowed logs, and even within medical supply crates. Lieutenant Lang coordinated discreet interviews with officers willing to provide signed statements corroborating the prisoners' experiences. "This is going to change everything," Rebecca said quietly one night. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's been denied dignity." Darius nodded. "It's bigger than vengeance. It's accountability, proof that humanity can exist, even in war." By early August 1945, the surrender of Japan was official. Repatriation plans were underway, and international journalists were allowed limited access to the camp. Darius knew this was their only chance. With careful planning, the prisoners arranged a secret press conference within the camp's infirmary. Calvin and Isaiah smuggled documents to the makeshift podium, while Rebecca ensured key officers, including Captain Eleanor Voss and Sergeant Klaus Reinhardt, were ready to corroborate the statements. The day arrived. Cameras flashed, microphones were positioned, and a room full of journalists from the San Francisco Chronicle, Los Angeles Times, and international agencies waited for a story. Darius stepped forward, wearing his tattered uniform and prisoner identification, hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "My name is Darius Cole, prisoner number 5831. He began in fluent, measured tones. "For the past 10 months, I have meticulously documented conditions at Camp Fleury's. I have collected testimonies, photographs, and records that reveal not only the reality of captivity, but the moral contradictions of our time." Gasps rippled through the room as he presented photographs of the infirmary, records of nutritious meals, and signed statements from guards and officers. Contrary to what we were taught, Darius continued, the men and women of this camp, both American and German, have exhibited acts of professional care, compassion, and adherence to international law. Yet, as a black soldier in my own country, I have faced neglect, discrimination, and denial of dignity. The very people who can uphold principles for prisoners abroad fail to apply them at home. The room fell silent. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and reporters whispered in disbelief. The audacity of a prisoner exposing systemic hypocrisy stunned even the most seasoned correspondents. Captain Eleanor Voss stepped forward, her voice calm and unwavering. I supervised the medical care for all prisoners in this facility, she said. The standards we upheld were not exceptions, they were policy. Every individual, regardless of race or nationality, was entitled to care, dignity, and protection. If our principles work here, they can and must work everywhere. Sergeant Klaus Reinhardt added his testimony. I have observed these treatments firsthand. The rules of conduct, applied consistently, can create a humane environment, even in war. Darius held up the final set of documents, letters from home, medical records, and comparisons between prisoner treatment and conditions faced by black soldiers in segregated U.S. units. The evidence is clear, Darius concluded. We have proven that dignity is not impossible, it is chosen. And if it can be applied to enemy prisoners, why not to our own citizens? The reporters erupted, asking questions, recording statements, and sending dispatches that would reach every major newspaper in the United States and abroad. The impact was immediate. Within months, the exposure led to investigations into racial discrimination in the U.S. military. President Truman, confronted with international scrutiny and undeniable evidence, signed Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, officially desegregating the armed forces. Darius Cole returned home a hero, not for combat valor alone, but for courage, intellect, and moral fortitude. He became an advisor on human rights policies, ensuring that principles of dignity and equality were embedded in military practice. Lieutenant Rebecca Lang, Isaiah Turner, and Calvin Rivers continued their advocacy, building careers around reform, education, and documentation of injustices. Nurse Margaret Latham and Captain Eleanor Voss were celebrated for their integrity and professionalism, setting new standards for humane treatment in military service. Even Sergeant Reinhardt was recognized posthumously for his quiet courage in supporting truth and justice. Years later, Darius reflected on the journey that had begun with fear, pain, and uncertainty. The words, "It hurts when I sit down," had transformed from a literal expression of physical agony into a metaphor for the moral and societal weight he had carried. Through courage, meticulous documentation, and unwavering dedication to truth, he had not only survived captivity but transformed injustice into systemic change. He often spoke to young soldiers, historians, and activists. The real enemies, he said, are not nations or races. They are prejudice, ignorance, and the refusal to see humanity in one another. When we choose dignity over hatred, the impossible becomes possible. Darius Cole passed away in 2009, honored by two nations, remembered as the prisoner who turned captivity into revolution. His records, preserved in the National Archives, became the foundation for decades of scholarship, advocacy, and reform, an enduring testament to the power of truth under fire.